SaaS Insiders, welcome. Today I'm interviewing David Keynes. He's the founder of Well Prepped and he's got quite an exciting story. He, just like every one of us, started his business, but he also did that while having a full-time job. So he managed to build his MVP while working 9 to 5 and now is working on scaling that. And he went through a lot of stages such as trying to hire the right team, building it, marketing it, validating. Just have a taste of this small 15-second of this episode.
And then I went through the process of vetting a bunch of teams, and I looked overseas and I looked domestically, and I didn't know what I didn't know, but I interviewed a bunch of teams, and it seemed to me that if, at least back then, if I wanted to go offshore, I would have had to have the skill set of a project manager to be able to coordinate everything. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I knew that wasn't one of my skill sets.
That's just a small piece of the interview you're about to hear right now. So that sounds exciting. Let's get down to it and listen to the full episode. This episode is sponsored by the SaaS Insiders Studio. We help SaaS founders build their minimum viable products, MVPs, launch quickly, find a product market fit, and grow from there. SaaS Insider Studio works with non-technical founders that are on the pre-seed or seed stage to help them execute on their product vision. To learn more, go to my LinkedIn profile that you can find in the description to this episode and shoot me a direct message there. All right, let's jump straight into today's episode. SaaS Insiders, welcome to this episode of our show. Today with me, I have David Keynes. He's a founder of Well Prepped, and today he's going to be sharing his story of how he went from just having a full-time job into now transitioning into being a founder of SaaS business and what we can learn from this journey as well. With that said, David, thank you for coming to the show.
Vlad, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
For those SaaS Insiders who might not know you yet, could you give a couple-minute introduction of who's David Keynes, where you're coming from, and what you're working on right now?
Sure. So I am a full-time practicing urologist. Urologists are doctors who operate on the urinary tract, kidney, bladder, prostate, etc. Well known for treating kidney stones, prostate cancer, things like that. I'm working on Well Prepped, which is a productivity tool for doctors so that they don't have to repeat themselves over and over as much and they can run their clinic more efficiently. It's trying to address the pain of burnout amongst physicians around the country, in the United States, around the world, actually. The brief 1,000-foot flyover of my life, I was born in South Africa originally, moved as a very young baby to Canada and then New York. I spent most of my childhood growing up in the New York area and stayed in the Northeast, and I'm now in the Boston area. I have a wife and 5 kids, actually. So very full life. And that I decided to add on this extra layer of being a SaaS founder is actually means that I might be a bit of a lunatic. But that's the overview of who I am.
Interesting. So you said it is a SaaS for doctors, and you being a doctor means like you're also close to this pain. You're probably not a physician, like you said, you're a urologist, right? But still, it's related to the industry you're working in.
Yeah. I'm felt the pain personally, directly in my practice as a practicing surgeon. I know there may be a very small violin playing for surgeons who are disgruntled with their jobs, but nevertheless, I felt the pain personally of being face to face in an exam room with a patient, finding myself explaining the same concepts over and over and over and over and over again, and feeling disconnected. One of the things we love as doctors is making a connection with another human being and having really meaningful interaction. And if I'm explaining, for example, kidney stones from a very basic level, and I've given that explanation 2,000 times, can lead to a feeling of disconnect and burnout.
That is a really interesting problem to solve. One thing that SaaS Insiders think, and I think it'll be interesting for you to elaborate, is when you're starting your SaaS journey, right? When you're looking for Do I want to make it a side hustle? Do I want to go all in? Almost all of the advice on the internet is you should go all in, because if it's a side hustle, it stays side hustle forever. And for most people, it is like this. For most people, when they do something on the side, couple hours per day, they usually don't take it much seriously. So we really rarely see people actually pushing through it and getting something meaningful from something they combine with their full-time job. It's really interesting for me, because for other founders as well, we talked a bit of it off air, that you actually combine having your SaaS and having a job. Could you share a little bit, like almost like how is that possible? Because almost all of the stories that we hear from founders, they either need to switch it full time, basically from the beginning, or they never really get to traction, never really start getting some results from it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, to be honest with you, sometimes when you look back at a story, it looks like it was all calculated and it's a straight line. But when you go through it, it's not exactly that way. So I'll just start by saying that a lot of this was out of necessity. So first of all, as I mentioned, I have a big family and I have to support the family, and I couldn't have just stopped working and start a SaaS. I'm also not a technical founder, so that also would have been very difficult. I couldn't have done the heavy lift of creating it and use my time as leverage. I didn't have that capability. So I would have had to stop my job, hire a team, and probably would not have been able to keep paying my bills. So some of it was out of necessity. And the second aspect was, I didn't start off saying to myself, I'm going to start a company around this. It kind of happened step by step, where just going along my primary job made the most sense. So let me give you an example, or I'll tell you exactly how it happened. So I'm in this scenario of feeling like something in my workflow needs to change. And so I started having my secretary send out PDFs on, for example, I see a lot of prostate cancer. And there's a PDF booklet explaining the basics of prostate cancer, which is fantastic. I started having her email that to patients before they showed up. The visits were so much better. Then I recorded a video on Loom of myself giving a couple of other explanations, and I sent those, and the visits with those patients were even better. And then I made a simple Linktree page, although it was a separate company called Shoreby. I leveraged the link in bio arena in order to make this into a very simple web page with buttons on it. And I was just trying to make my secretary's life easier, because she could just share one URL instead of, the 20 that I had collected. So that became the sort of prototype. It was just leveraging some third-party software in order to accomplish what I wanted. Again, I was only just trying to help my own workflow, not wanting to start a company. And it had such a big impact that then I took that same model and I made prototype pages for 10 other doctors just to see, like, was this just me or would this help other people? And those doctors were raving about it. In fact, a couple of them reprinted their business cards with the QR code for their collection of, links, because it was so much a part of their workflow that they were voting with actually reprinting their business cards. It was only at that point that I said, all right, there's a business idea here. I have to spread this around, because these doctors were so bullish on this idea that they were like, oh my God, this has improved my clinic. So it evolved. When it evolves piecemeal like that, there was, it was the obvious solution for me to just keep working on it while keeping a full-time job.
It really sounds like your job actually was almost like a polygon for testing those things. It means like it fits so perfectly because it's for your workflow and the people around you. So it sounds like it even made sense to work, because you could actually test those things like in real life on your example.
Yeah, except for one thing. As soon as they initially was just scratching my itch, and I was sending patients to these resources anyway. Once I realized that it may have potential outside of just me, I sort of stopped testing it in my own workplace so that there would be no conflict of interest. Only tested it with outside doctors, because I didn't want to mix the two endeavors. So my feedback from them became primarily from other doctors using it. But I see what you mean. Certainly I was a content expert for sure in this problem.
One thing, David, you've mentioned is you're not technical founder, right? I mean, you don't come from engineering background. And majority of SaaS founders these days, at least in our SaaS and service audience, are not technical as well. And when you cannot contribute with technology, with solutions, you need to contribute with marketing and with capital, right? So how did you organize the workflow, your company, so that the product was built? How did you go about hiring talent? Was it an outsourcing model, in-house model? Could you elaborate, like, how did you approach getting that to market? Because people are wondering all the time.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I have to tell you, I'm not making this up because I'm on a podcast right now. I'm telling you, the next thing I did was I consumed hundreds of hours of podcasts involving SaaS entrepreneurship at 2x speed for weeks. So, Rob Walling's podcast, Startups for the Rest of Us, I mean, hundreds of hours and a few others. And so, because I didn't even have the language to understand what SaaS meant and what the building blocks were. And so I must have listened to hundreds of stories, which makes me so excited to be telling my story right now, because I know that it helped me to hear other people's stories. But that's the first thing I did. And that's when I started to understand about testing before you build anything and what marketing was going to be involved. I learned enough web design to be dangerous and made my own website, created a wait list with MailChimp, and used Zapier in order to create a whole bunch of workflows for myself. So I was certainly non-technical, but I am able to learn quickly, and I am very interested in learning new things. And so I was able to build at least the shell of a building block of something by myself. And then I went through the process of vetting a bunch of teams, and I looked overseas and I looked domestically, and I didn't know what I didn't know, but I interviewed a bunch of teams, and it seemed to me that at least back then, if I wanted to go offshore, I would have had to have the skill set of a project manager to be able to coordinate everything. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But I knew that wasn't one of my skill sets. And I ended up settling on an agency domestically in the US who I hired, and they worked on creating version 1. As you know, it's never done, but we'll call it version 1, that's now out in the wild. So that was my first foray into building well prepped.
It really makes me smile when you say version 1, but it's never done, right? We always have, as a founders, it's always like one more feature. Okay, one more feature. What? One more and it's going to be fine. No, one more. Before you know it, you build this elephant that you want to release, but it's just...
it's like a giant continuous work in progress. I mean, there's no end to it. But so the team was in Boise, Idaho, and they did a great job. But, the other thing I'll say is at that point, I had a prototype, but it wasn't like I could spec out something specifically and say, build this. And if I could have done that, I think I could have gone to an offshore team in a cost-effective way. But I knew that I needed help, not just building something, but iterating. I needed a team that was going to help me interview users and get feedback and start with an idea and change it and go back to the drawing board. And so in the first year, there was a lot of back and forth, and we thought this was going to work and it didn't work. And, Zoom recording, people onboarding and realizing that things we thought were obvious were not obvious to the users, and going back to the drawing board. And so when I reflect back on that year, I think that really was necessary because I didn't have the skill set to do that on my own.
What kind of advice can you give to founders who are in a similar situation? And now we can evolve from that position. But if I'm a SaaS insider who's listening to this and just feels like I just need someone to help me, get this sorted. I'm not sure how I'll iterate on my product. Like now, from your view of your current David, like what kind of steps did you take to break through that wall?
Well, from what stage specifically? From the idea stage or further along?
Well, I guess the situation where you cannot really scope out what you're trying to achieve. Like you have the vision, just like you described, right? You know the problem, but just how do we package this into something meaningful that we can deliver and learn from the marketplace?
That's a great question. It's often talked about, but very hard to do. When people say, like, get the crappiest basic version together that proves the concept and show it to people early. Like, that's the prevailing advice. It's so hard to actually get yourself to do it, but I think I really did do that. I mean, the prototype that I did to borrow on third-party software that had no login capability. I had to build the pages for the early users. They couldn't edit it themselves. They had to email me the changes. I had to manually do it myself. If one of their colleagues wanted a page, I would say, "Oh yeah, we can do that." And I was manually copying and pasting every resource into this makeshift thing, and then actually got the first paying users. I didn't mention that before. The first paying users off the prototype, not even the thing. And I'd heard that advice before I did that. And very scary to approach somebody and ask them to open their wallet on the thing that you know is just like the most basic, crappiest version of what you actually envision. But thank God I did that, because it gave me the courage when they said yes, gave me the courage, I'm bootstrapping this and, putting a lot of money at risk. And so it gave me more courage to think, all right, like, this is not a complete gamble. Somebody paid for it. I'm not a complete idiot. Maybe it'll crash and burn anyway. But you need to do something like that, whether it's a Notion database or a Google Sheet, or with a Zapier thing going on in the background, some crappy cobbled together thing, especially for non-technical founders. All that stuff is really within reach. It is frightening to ask the first paying user to open up their wallet, even when, especially when they're looking at something that you've cobbled together that is nowhere near what you imagine the final product would be. But thank God I did that, because, I had to protect myself on the downside, and you need that kind of evidence in order to move forward and actually fork over the money for development. I mean, you're de-risking the process to some degree. So even for a non-technical person like me, whether it's like a clickable Figma prototype or a Zapier connection to a Google Sheet or a Notion or something, I mean, there's ways to get the core product idea in front of people before you take the next step. Does that kind of resonate with you as well?
I think there's a saying that says lousy success is better than the perfect failure. And I think it describes it that you want to prove it first. You want to give me some signs that I'm not going in the opposite direction. Give me some people who can say yes with their wallet, and that will give me, right? It's almost like if we knew ahead of time that we'll get a high chance of success, we wouldn't be so anxious to invest whatever amount it is, whatever amount of time, energy, and resources, right? But it's this thing when we need to get validation of what we're doing. And that's what usually keeps people from
Exactly. Another way of saying that, and I was given this advice, is if you need to fail fast. If it's going to fail, it should fail quickly. So I did take that to heart. Not to say that each decision is easy in a forward-looking fashion. In fact, every decision is very muddy. I feel like you're just acting at every point with your best guess at what the way forward is, an educated guess. So far in the journey, their decisions have never been like, flashing neon signs, like obvious. It's like, I think this is the right way to go.
Interesting. So you've got a few users, you said, from basically like assembling a prototype of how it might look like, but actually doing the backend yourself.
Yeah, the back end was all, me copying and pasting resources into this prototype. They would email me a change they want to make. I would say, sure, no problem. And then I, feverishly, copy and paste on the back end. It was a lot of manual work, but
it's resourceful, right? That's what different between resourceful people and people. It's, you're not lacking resources, you're lacking resourcefulness. The person who knows what to be achieved, they'll figure out a way, just like you did. You might not have the resources and the team to do that, but you figured out other way. It takes your time, but needs to prove the model first.
Yeah, I mean, there was no, I guess I've heard founders described as people who generally are biased towards action. And I think, I just have a sort of proclivity to just do it. I mean, If a doctor said, hey, my friend wants one of these pages, can you do it? And I knew it was like hours of copy pasting. So yeah, absolutely. And by the next day, it would be done. I would have to wake up at 5 in the morning to get it done before my full-time job. But the other thing that did was kept me very close to the end user. Like a couple of friends said, you should hire a VA in the Philippines. This stuff is like, you shouldn't be doing this copy paste. If you can describe to somebody how to do it in a Loom video, you should pawn that off to a VA. And maybe I should have, but this kind of stuff kept me so close to the users that I feel like I kept that close to the first 200 people who have onboarded. And so, when they say do things that don't scale, let me tell you a couple of things that I did that do not scale. So once we had the product that was actually developed by a real team of programmers, as soon as somebody onboarded, I was manually emailing each person. And the way that I knew that somebody onboarded was I got CC'd the verification email from onboarding. Just like the most low budget way of figuring out that I had a new user was I get that email that, oh, somebody needed an email verification. I wonder who this is. And I would check on their page that they'd made, recorded a Loom video of me sort of congratulating them on arriving to this thing and my comments about their page and the resources that they had chosen for their patients and encouraging them to keep going. And that was, I probably sent 80 or 90 personalized Loom videos to those users. And I just know if I received something like that, I would be so happy that somebody cared enough. It wasn't an act. I really was genuinely interested in hoping that they succeeded. So it was easy to do it, but it was very time consuming and, definitely not scalable. But people responded sort of like shocked that they had gotten this video. And I think it made them feel committed to giving it their best shot at building out their pages that they would show patients and stuff like that. And it encouraged people to be person. I didn't hire anybody for support. There's still nobody for support except me. So any of the questions that come up, they go right to me. But I wouldn't do that differently looking back, because I know so much about what goes wrong with the product. I know so much about what the users care about. And it would have been easy for me to say, hey, I'm a doctor. I'm one of those users. I know everything that they're thinking. But they frequently surprise me. They complain about things that don't bother me, etc.
And one thing we talked about off the air is you're actually moving towards having an investment in company, meaning having a round to continue growing the company. What do you think will need to be changed to be investable in your process? Do you think that this like unscalable things need to be readjusted, or like what's your take? What's the different well prepped will be to be ready for investment?
Yeah, so you're right. All the manual processes that I am doing need to be automated. We're working on that now, so that so we need to get the users to the aha moment. And for well prepped, that aha moment is they've shown their page to the patient, they show up to the visit. That visit is awesome and better than the doctor's used to. Okay. That's the aha moment. In order for me to get there, the doctor has to do a lot of work. They got to decide they want to use this, go through onboarding, add some detail to their pages, verify that the content is correct, add their own content. Then they need to somehow build it into their workflow. They need to tell their secretary to send it to the patient. There's a lot that needs to happen. We need not manual, but automatic processes that nudge the early user in a drip sequence to get them to that moment. So we're making moves in the works to make that happen. The app itself, we mentioned, is never done. The infrastructure of the app needs to continue to be built up so that, all the usual things, internal testing is present and et cetera, et cetera. So the app needs to continue to be made more robust. We do have some unfair advantages though. And I would acknowledge that one of the unfair advantages is that the users are doctors who may have additional disposable income. And many of them have already raised their hands and said, hey, if you raise a round, I would like to invest. And that's been one of the most satisfying aspects of this so far, is that those are the users. So users have been so delighted by this that they're going a step further and saying, hey, here's my vote of confidence. But I would acknowledge that not all founders have user bases that are make a healthy living. So,
I agree, but it's still
yeah.
phenomenal, right? It's not just enough to be serving the wealthy audience to make them invest. You need to solve a great problem of such an extent that they truly believe this is going to be a growing venture, that they believe other people also want it, not just them, right? So
Yeah.
it tells about size of a problem that you're solving. So that's really cool.
Appreciate that.
What kind of plan do you see for well prepped? Because a lot of founders, they're curious, like, so I raise this round, I get some resources, what do I do next, right? Where do I invest this? So now I have a bit more freedom, a bit more resources to spend, but I also want to be very wise of what I'm doing with this, because we're not raising money just to burn it, right? We want to use it wisely. What do you think you would be focusing on with well prepped once you have the capital to work with?
Yeah. So I want to keep the team small, because one of the things that I love about, going on this journey is, everywhere I've ever worked has been very well established places and established hospitals, and things move very slowly. And it's like incredible to be working on something where you decide something's going to happen and it just happens. So I want to keep the team small, but I do have to start paying the team a salary. So there's no question that some of the funds will go there. A lot of them is going to go into product. The majority is going to go into product development, because again, it's a proof of concept stage product now. It's great, but it just, there's so many more layers that need to be put into it until I'd consider it to be a full product. It's not a full product yet. And so the lion's share is going to go into that. Marketing is going to be part of it, because I'm beyond the point of wondering if there's other doctors out there who would find this useful. Now, just a question of finding those people and putting this in front of them in a way that catches their attention. And so marketing is the other piece. That's how I see it. What I'm really encouraged by is, when you have something like this, you always wonder, like, what's the viral coefficient? What's the chance that somebody tells someone else? So far, people tend to tell their friends, their colleagues, hey, I've got this thing, like, you should try it. I don't exactly know what the viral coefficient is yet, but that's another benefit of staying close to the users. Every single one I say, hey, how'd you find about this? 9 times out of 10, they say, oh, my friend is so-and-so and they're using it. So yeah, I got off on a bit of a tangent there, but that's where I see, the next phase of well prepped.
Well, I mean, wait till you add a referral program on top of that. For example, they refer someone, they get 1 month free, right? That's going to another level.
Right. There's one other thing that I just want to mention, because part of the advantages that I'm a doctor and I don't know anything about SaaS, or at least I didn't when I started, is that when I heard advice, I really paid attention to it. So, I hear people say you should really niche down. And for me, that meant I was only going to start with doctors who are in the exact same specialty as me, because that's what I know the best. So we did do that. We focused just on urologists, and to prove it out. And so when you say what's the next phase for well prep, we're going to start moving into other verticals, which means other specialties, other types of doctors.
One question, David, that I love to ask, because we really learn a lot from it, is if you were to go back when you started with well prepped, what do you think are the things, are the strategies and mindset that changed from that moment that you would love probably to have in the beginning? Like, what are some of the learning experiences, something you would just love to know? Like, oh, only if I knew this when I started with my SaaS. What kind of those things do you have in mind from your experience right now?
I wish, well, there is some advice that I didn't follow well that I really wish in retrospect that I had. And when I told you we started off free because we wanted to create a buzz, and now we're starting to charge. I went against some advice people were giving. They said, just charge from the start. And I didn't do that. And I think I mean, I did for a few early users. I told you I tested pricing when I had the prototype, but I didn't continue that. If I could go back, I would start charging from the very beginning. And I didn't do that out of fear and a feeling of discomfort. Like my skill set is having a vision for this idea. My skill set is in having the pain myself. My skill set is in, really hustling and getting stuff done and learning new things. But selling stuff to people is not a skill set of mine. And I start to feel very apologetic when we're sorry, we're going to start charging.
Oh.
And, so if I could go back and give myself a pep talk, it would be, listen, you're solving people's problems. This can't exist for free. It just can't. In order for it to be a sustainable solution, it costs money. You can't host it for people, etc. So, and I would tell myself, explain why it costs something and go for it unapologetically, because you're helping people solve a problem, and that can't happen for free.
Do you think it had some effect on also converting the existing customers? Like you mentioned that you needed to have this like conversation, like, yeah, we're going to start charge about it. Do you think that would be different if it was just like from the beginning, if they were paid users from day one?
I think it would be a little bit different because people get used to something being free, and then it seems like a different thing to be charging. And if you're doing it from the beginning, then that's just the way it is. I will say that doctors specifically are not used to paying for their productivity software. They are definitely paying for it, but they don't see who's writing the check. Whereas creators, for example, are very used to knowing I got to pay such and such for MailChimp, and I need such and such for Google Workspace, and I need, it's $8 here, $10, $49, $110. They build their business on a series of monthly subscriptions. For doctors, that's, unless they're out on their own with their own practices, they don't necessarily see that. So I'm also having to teach, in some cases, this new behavior. Or an analogy will be made to something that just doesn't apply. Like, for example, but Netflix is only $12 a month, So I'll say, well, when we get 1 billion users, we'll lower the price for you. So, some of it is educating your own user base.
I heard this one horror story of a person actually from my network. They were building this SaaS product, but it was just a tool that they distributed for free. It was a research Chrome extension, so pretty basic extension. But they quickly realized they solved a real problem because they started getting users, and before they knew it, they had like 1,500 users that they're using on a daily basis. Now that's a pretty active audience. Then the question came, well, let's monetize it, right? They couldn't sell $1 per month subscription. They just couldn't. They needed to fight for that to get $1,500 per month, because it's 1,500 users, $1 per month, right? And they got so much hate, like, you changed, you just want the money. And it really comes from the expectations, because when you position something as free, people just naturally perceive it as something that they can get for free, right? It's so hard to change the behavior, especially if they're used to it, right? Rather than just in the beginning, it's $1 per month. I mean, I'm not sure what you can buy for $1 in US, really, or pretty much anywhere. So
right,
I think it also comes from like training this behavior in the beginning.
I think you're absolutely right. Fortunately, I'll say, as we are converting free users to paid users in batches, thankfully, the majority, far over the majority, is saying yes, sure, no problem. We're getting very little pushback, thank goodness. But I would have preferred not to have had to go through this. Now that I know what the cost of bringing something like this into the universe, it's substantial, and especially for non-technical founders. So I think, if you're really solving someone's problem and you're passionate about it and your primary goal is to help them, then, paying for something should seem obvious. I pay for tons of apps in my own life that I find useful happily. And so I think that fear was largely unfounded.
I think if we go a bit deeper in ourselves, oftentimes, for example, for me, oftentimes before I found that it's not in users' head that they not should be paying for this. It's more in my head, because it's almost like I have to justify for myself that this is valuable. Because if I see that it's really solving the problem for people, they don't mind paying. It's just a lot of times we ourselves kind of limiting what can be done just because we don't necessarily see that it can be charged for. That's what I found in my observations.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. I think I agree completely.
One of the things before we wrap up our amazing episode today, what do you think were the most inspiring and educational resources you could recommend to a SaaS founder who is getting started on their journey? Maybe it's an interesting book that brought huge progress to your development. Maybe it's an inspirational speaker, mentor, community. If you could name 2 to 3 sources, what do you think were the most impactful for you?
I'll start with 2 books. The number one book recommendation is April Dunford's Obviously Awesome. That is the book I recommend the most. The second is Crossing the Chasm. I know these are very popular recommendations, but I found them to be very helpful for me. Let me just tell you a little bit more about why. So April Dunford's book, Obviously Awesome, it's never too early to think about positioning. There are many ways that I could have positioned this exact same thing very poorly. Let me give you an example. If I said, doctors, I have a way for you to make websites. I mean, not compelling at all. And it comes up with a whole bunch of objections that I don't want to have to defend. I don't need a website. Why do I need a website? So instead, it really is a productivity tool for doctors and so thinking about a positioning hypothesis early on was directly out of April Dunford's book and changed the way I approached it. And if I had to change my positioning later, it's much more difficult. And I might not have reached the traction that I did without it. Crossing the Chasm lets you rethink in a very specific way how any new idea is adopted, where early adopters will flock to you because they nearly imagined that awesome thing that you created, but you could get lulled into a false sense of security, like every new user is going to come to you like that, when really the early majority, the next phase with a huge chasm in between, are people who are much more skeptical, who don't really want to hear about all the features. They do feel the pain, but they're much more conservative about adopting it. The strategy for explaining a product to those people may be completely different. So those 2 books were life-changing. I'm very active on Twitter, and the SaaS and founder community on Twitter is amazing. I've sort of inserted myself initially as just a voyeur, just consuming other people's content, and then occasionally participating. But I learned so much from the Twitter community that I found that invaluable. I already mentioned podcasts, which I consume like absolute crazy person. When I find podcasts, I binge every single episode. But that's when you really hear people's in-depth stories and learn from their mistakes. And every single episode I listen to, I can think of something or an idea that pops into my head on how that applies to what I'm doing. So those are the main. The last thing I'll mention is I did surround myself with what I would call like a pseudo board of advisors. I have a group of mentors who I frequently call on for advice unofficially. These are either friends of mine or people with completely opposite skill sets to me, people who are in finance or who are in venture capital, who have been generous with their time. And I just check in, here's what I'm up to. And they got 3 or 4 ideas that are like perfect for the next 6 months for me to think about. So you need to assemble your own kind of sounding board support group. I think that's been also instrumental in helping me avoid making too many mistakes.
SaaS Insiders, I hope you're taking notes of this, because there's so many resources here. What would be the best way for our audience and for everyone's listening to connect with you if they want to contribute to what you're doing, maybe seek some advice? You've mentioned Twitter, right, is one of the places.
Yeah, my handle on Twitter is @CanesDavid, CanesDavid. My DMs are open, and I would love to chat. It's a pretty easy way to get in touch with me. Probably on the WellPrep website. I think I have an email link on the bottom. It's WellPrepped is a deliberate misspelling. It's WELLPREPT.com. So I'm pretty easily reachable in both of those ways.
We'll put those in the description of the episode so everyone's listening can easily access them, not only by ear, but actually just clicking on the link. David, what do you think would be the final thoughts for our episode today? If a SaaS Insider could take just one big takeaway out of this, if it's only one thing, one topic, one theme they took out, what those final words would be?
My final parting thought is in the category of finding an idea for a SaaS in the first place. I'll tell you, I have come up with dozens of terrible ideas in my life. And the difference with this one is that the idea would not leave me alone. And I mean that, like I could, the idea came to me, I wouldn't shut up about it. I wouldn't stop talking to my wife about it. I wouldn't stop talking to my friends about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. If you have an idea that won't leave you alone, those are the ones to pursue because it means you're wedded to it, you love it, and you have the passion to do all those grueling things that won't feel like work because you're consumed and you love the idea.
David Keynes, everyone. David, I thank you so much for taking the time to connect with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been great.
SaaS Insiders, we'll see you in the next episodes.